Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Philip Gooding. I'm a project manager at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University. For this podcast, I am joined by Professor Fiona Williamson. Professor Williamson is a Professor of Environmental History in the College of Integrative Studies at Singapore Management University. She is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and co-president of the International Commission for the History of Meteorology. Among many other publications, she is the author of 2 monographs. Her first was entitled Social Relations and Urban Space, Norwich, 1600 to 1700, which was published in 2014 with Boydell and Brewer. But in this podcast, we'll be discussing her second book, which was published earlier this year with University of Pittsburgh Press. It is entitled Imperial Weather, Meteorology, Science and the Environment in Colonial Malaya. Professor Williamson, thank you so much for joining me for this podcast.
Thanks for having me here.
I wanted to start by just asking you kind of the background to this project on imperial weather. What brought you to the history of meteorology and science in colonial Malaya? What were your inspirations? And what did you hope to achieve as you set out on the project?
Sure. Well, as you noted in your introduction, this is my second monograph, and the title of the first monograph could not be any more radically different. So, that was work that came out of my PhD when I was studying early modern British history. And then, of course, I've had something of a complete, not reversal, but just a complete kind of shift geographically and also slightly in terms of time chronology as well, moving to the Imperial Weather Project. So I would say that I wouldn't necessarily even describe it as a project. It's been more of a kind of a shift in my research overall over the last maybe 10 to 15 years, moving literally physically, myself moving physically from the UK to Southeast Asia, and then getting into kind of British sources of history, colonial history, in the new space that I found myself in, which was firstly Malaysia and then Singapore. And I think one of the things that I found particularly interesting is being able to connect the British side of the history that I was familiar with the new kind of Southeast Asian sources that I was finding in the archives here. Of course, it's always, in some respects, easy to look at archives in the places where you now are because you've got physical proximity. But it was also really interesting because I realized that there's not actually that many people who've looked at the environmental history of Malaysia and Singapore. So it felt a bit like breaking new ground. There's a lot of sources that haven't been used, or they certainly haven't been used from an environmental or a history of science perspective. So that was quite inspirational, being able to kind of look at a lot of these new things, or new sources that simply hadn't been used in this way before. And I think having had a little bit of experience with environmental and weather history in the UK, that seemed to be an area that was of interest to me here. Again, because the history of weather or history of environment has barely been told for this part of the world. So that was really what kind of kept me going and getting interested in this hugely new subject.
So you mentioned actually in your acknowledgement section that your first encounter with the study of weather was with Rob Allen and Clive Wilkinson, who are both climatologists, and that was when you were a PhD student. You also mentioned that your book benefited from the input of many, quote, curious research assistants. And I wonder if you could speak about both your experience as an RA working with climatologists and to how you've involved RAs in your current research. And I suppose, how does kind of the pedagogy involved in meeting with, training and working with research assistants kind of inform your scholarship?
Sure. Well, for the first part of that very much connects with your first question about how I kind of got into doing this. So when I was still based in the UK and finishing off my PhD, I met actually a historian. Clive Wilkinson is a historian, and he was working at the University of East Anglia where I was at that time, and I vaguely knew him from the history department. And he approached me saying, would you like to work as an RA? We're looking for somebody who has proficiency in early modern paleography because we want somebody to work on a weather project, but it's looking at early modern documents. So that was kind of my first introduction to weather history. It was actually from Clive, who said to me, come and work as this RA. And Rob at that time was at the UKMO, the UK Meteorological Office, and he was running the project. And it was a project to recover weather data from East India Company ship logbooks. So hence I got involved because of the early modern proficiency, so being able to read the handwriting. But they introduced me to this kind of huge project which was working on history of weather, but specifically to reclaim meteorological data for science. So at that time, I was very like, oh, I don't really know anything about this, but sure, it's a summer job and I need the experience. And it was going to be 5 months working at the British Library in London, reclaiming this information from the East India Company logs. And it was through that I started getting this kind of sense of like Southeast Asia and also the weather history and the importance of that, but still by being kind of very much grounded in the early modern period. So that was one of the things that really helped me kind of transition across. And I think that, one of the things that Clive was always saying to me, and Rob as well, is that it's all very well extracting data from logbooks, but you also have to have context. And that's part of what the historian's job is, to add that context. You need to be able to add that kind of granularity of, well, what instruments were they using? What were the conditions that those instruments, meteorological instruments, were being kept in? Why is there a gap from this year to that year? What kind of historical conditions can explain those gaps? And those are the things that maybe the scientists, they want to know, but they don't have the time or the inclination to work out what was going on. But in order for that data to be considered accurate and for it to go through all the kind of quality assurance checks that the scientists need, you actually have to pull in that historical context. So I guess that's what started me looking at meteorological records specifically, and then kind of looking at context and then pulling out more and more information and going further down that research path. So Rob and Clive were really kind of instrumental in bringing me from the early modern to Southeast Asian weather history. And I think in terms of thinking about the research assistants, because I was a research assistant and because that particular job in that summer was so important to me because I didn't know it at the time. It was just one of those things I was like, yeah, I'll do this. And I didn't realize at the time if I could have known that, kind of 15 years or maybe actually even longer later, my whole kind of research would have ended up in this direction, kind of based really very much on what that original research project was talking about. I just didn't have a clue. So for me, that experience as an RA was actually quite career making. I don't know if that's a term, but it really kind of made my career what it is today. So I like to kind of take that ethos with my research assistants. I mean, a lot of them have just been, my students here, and for them, it has just been a summer job. And they've ended up kind of graduating and going into, I don't know, marketing and business or something. So completely irrelevant. But I think for some of them, it has actually started them off on a slightly different trajectory. And if I can help young scholars, even if it's just with some experience or just with thinking through some of the things that they're interested in, I'm really, really keen to do that. And that, there's so many young people coming out of their PhDs right now who are struggling in the job market that if I can offer them something or some kind of assistance, I feel like I feel really privileged to be able to help them in the way that Rob and Clive helped me all those years ago.
But thank you. It makes me feel a lot more comfortable as well about having research assistants and the way we try and teach them at the IWC too. So it's great to hear your perspective on it. So let's delve a little bit more into the book. One of the main themes in the early part of the book is that colonial meteorology in Malaya lagged behind the meteorology of other colonies, such as India, Hong Kong, Mauritius, and Australia, especially in the second half of the 19th century. Can you explain the background here? Why was this the case? Why did meteorology in other colonies, British and I should say otherwise as well, receive more attention than Singapore and the other Strait settlements?
Yeah, well, I think there's two or three answers to this. Firstly, I mean, Malaya, the Strait settlements, was simply just not as important to the British colonial government in the 19th century. I don't think it really became that important to them until the rubber boom of the early 1900s. And at that point, Malaya suddenly becomes like this extremely relevant and economically viable colony. But before that, economically, it was just kind of a bit of a hinterland. It didn't seem to have the importance that some of the other colonies, particularly India, had. Because of that, the British government were always very reluctant to really invest much money into Malaya. Their general attitude was, well, you want to do this new project? Well, then you can raise the money for it yourself. You've got a mercantile industry, you've got some rich people living there, you can raise your own money through taxes or through donations. And they did give loans, but they were always reluctant to kind of sponsor big projects. The only big project that really happened in the 19th century for science was part of the magnetic experiments in the 1840s. But they had observatories for about 5 years in different countries, including in Canada and India and one in Singapore. But it didn't last for very long. They pulled the funding, particularly for the one in Singapore. And after that, they didn't really make any other investment. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that there wasn't really anything for them in Malaya to make that kind of investment. So there was a lack of money. There was a bit of a lack of interest, especially compared to the colonies that were the big colonies for the UK, like India. But at the same time, I think the weather itself is really important. In India or in Hong Kong, you've got cyclones, you've got the monsoon, and these are really impactful events that make a huge difference in India to the agricultural economy, or in Hong Kong to the mercantile community. And there's also the potential for huge losses of human life, but also economic losses as well. But the weather in Malaya was a lot more stable. You do have a monsoon, but its effects are dampened down, and you do have you don't have any cyclone activity. So there just isn't that kind of urgency. I mean, the observatory in Hong Kong, which was opened in around 1884, a lot of the reason for that was because they wanted something for the shipping community, to help forecast typhoons and to give storm warnings. But you don't really have that in Malaya. Of course, you get storms, but nothing like the intensity that you have in Hong Kong. So there just didn't seem on many fronts to have urgency in the same way that they did in other areas.
This very much sounds like a history of colonial neglect almost.
Yeah,
Um,
that's how I feel about it.
yeah. So, and this is really, really interesting, and it completely contrasts with a lot of the more well-known meteorological stories, particularly from this late period. I suppose this makes it kind of a case that stands out, at least in terms of my understanding. It makes your book follow a different trajectory, certainly for the 19th century, of many other books on the history of science and the history of meteorology. So then for you, then why is it important to analyze kind of these gaps in imperial knowledge production? What do these gaps tell us? And particularly in terms of the production of science. Do they tell us anything particular about colonialism in Malaya? Or even more broadly, to borrow the name from the title of this podcast, the broader Indian Ocean world?
Yeah, so I think it is important to tell stories of neglect or malaise, or where there are big gaps, because they offer a counterpoint to other forms of history. We tend to think of, and this is generalizing hugely, but we tend to think of science as kind of generally progressive. And I don't feel that in Malaysia or Singapore it really was. There were these kind of peaks of interest, flurries almost of just like, okay, we'll do this. Oh yeah, that failed. Let's just not do anything for the next 50 years. And it really wasn't until Malaya started making a lot more money, by kind of the 1920s, 1930s, and also aviation comes along, that there actually becomes like a lot more interest in investing here. But a lot of that was to do with military and aviation, rather than anything else. And it always kind of surprises me. It's like, well, Malaya was an agricultural country. So weren't you interested in the weather just to boost the agriculture, but it didn't seem like the weather was extreme enough to really warrant that investment nonetheless. And I think in terms of filling gaps, it kind of offers a different perspective. It offers a very cogent way of explaining how colonialism was linked to the history of science. This sense in a very detrimental way, but it also offers this counterpoint to histories of science in observatories in other countries, which had more of a direct relationship with colonialism, perhaps, and the generation of knowledge. Here, I feel like knowledge came in, but it wasn't generated and went out. Which I think when you're thinking about that kind of idea of the circulation of knowledge, it feels like Malaya was a bit of a sponge, but they weren't producing any knowledge. There was nobody here who was actually able to do very much research to kind of further that knowledge. The information that we're using here was stuff that was coming in from, say, Germany, from the UK. Um, all these ideas that were common in the 19th century about, say, desiccation or maybe climate change, but it was all coming in from the outside and being interpreted, but then not being reinterpreted and reimagined within this context. It was simply being absorbed. So I think that's interesting, thinking about the production of knowledge.
I absolutely agree. I want to kind of dive into who is actually producing this knowledge. You've referred to kind of the government being selling that, oh, there's telling them that, oh, you need to raise funds yourselves. There's a few rich people who can raise funds. I would like to delve into a little bit more of that as well. In the book, you often refer to, for example, colonial Renaissance men,
Yeah.
as well as to basically a multitude of other male individuals in the medical, museum, and forestry departments who were at the forefront of any kind of knowledge production, limited though it was, in terms of comparison to what an institution might generate. What was it about these, I suppose, scientific men? Could you tell us a little bit more about their social lives, both in Singapore and Georgetown? And also, where are the women? Do they figure at all in the creation of this kind of very sparse and limited knowledge in this period?
Yeah, I'd love to be able to tell the hidden history of the women meteorologists in colonial Malaya. Honestly, I haven't found any, not even a single reference, nothing, zero. I mean, maybe we could argue that some of the colonial officers' wives were making the observations when they were on holiday. I don't know. But I've found no evidence at all, which is unusual because I've studied Hong Kong and the observatory in Hong Kong, there was a place for women. There was obviously a place for women in observatories in other parts of Asia and in Europe. Malaya, nothing, absolutely nothing. And there weren't any dedicated scientists either. The observations, the meteorology, the debates about meteorology, the debates about science were all being enacted by colonial officers. As you rightly noted, there would be people from the medical department, people from the forestry department, maybe later on, engineers, and just the general kind of day-to-day officials. And they were the people who were writing into the journals, so the local circulation of journals. And these were just regular colonial officials, but they were people who had interests in geology, in climate, in nature. And they tended to write about all these different subjects. But actually, by day, they might have been a lawyer, or they were a plantation owner, but actually they had a colonial service position as well, and they did the plantation kind of on the side. And that's partly why they're interested in the weather, because they were interested in the weather because of their crops. But none of them were scientists. Some of them were maybe ex-mariners or had like that kind of naval experience. So they had some kind of scientific training, perhaps, but none of them were scientists. And this is basically for the entire 19th century. There were no kind of dedicated scientists. The first actual like trained meteorological officer doesn't come to Singapore until about 1928. Before that, it's purely, the person who actually set up the meteorological department, which was set up in 1929, he was in charge of the museums. He was the official in charge of the museums department. And he just happened on the side to be really interested in nature and in weather. And he used to be one of these people who organized lots of expeditions, kind of exploratory expeditions up to, Mount Kinabalu, or to various unexplored parts of, the Malaysian highlands. And he was really interested in weather for that perspective. So yeah, there were no women as far as I can find. And even, if we think about like indigenous knowledge, there was almost no taking on board of indigenous knowledge either, at least not that I've ever come across. There was kind of anthropological studies and studies of, the natives, which the same colonial officials were undertaking. And they might have discussed some of their belief systems, but they didn't take on board their ideas. All their ideas, the things that they quote, were all current European ideas coming in.
It's absolutely fascinating. It sounds completely bizarre. But
Yeah, because there's so many histories these days talking about, the place of women, or the histories of kind of indigenous knowledge, and I just can't find anything for colonial Malaya. Nothing.
oh, then in that case, it's probably unsurprising. So in the second half of your book, later on in your book, you move on to kind of discussing weathers and weather variability's effects on society in colonial Malaya. Colonial governments absolutely fumbled their responses and preparedness to natural hazards, such as meteorological drought. We can talk about lack of political will, lack of finance, convoluted bureaucratic structures, just lack of institutions. And this resulted in increased levels of social vulnerability to disasters over time, especially for the urban and peri-urban poor. I wanted to kind of moving kind of beyond your book a little bit here as well. Are these patterns still in place? Are they reversible? Have they been reversed in more recent years? What challenges of where does the weather fit now in life in Singapore and in urban Malaysia? And what have kind of governments done in response to these challenges?
Yeah. So now this is an interesting point, and I would say that if there's any kind of production of knowledge going on, it certainly isn't about climate or climate science when it comes into taking into account kind of indigenous perspectives. One of the ways, though, that indigenous communities did contribute to environmental management, though, a little bit more obvious because they have some place that a lot of peninsular Malaysia is rice growing areas. And long before the British came along, there have been systems of irrigation, water wheels, systems of moving water around so that when there's a drier season, the rice will still have enough water to grow. And the British carried on enabling or using those indigenous systems for a long time. They actually didn't bring in like large scale irrigation systems to a lot of areas at all. They just continued to use a lot of the, there was some experiments in the 20s and the 30s, like for particular areas to bring in kind of Western style irrigation systems, which I think they'd adapted from places like India. But otherwise, farmers were just carrying on as they always had to produce rice. But what I would say, though, is that when it came to things like natural hazards, I would say that a lot of the structures of colonialism actually made a lot of these things worse. Not deliberately so, not because they necessarily, well, they did sometimes fumble things. They tried to, a lot of their flood policy actually made things worse, particularly in urban areas. They would try and redirect rivers, which actually ended up just flooding different areas. And they seem to mess around an awful lot with building materials, which I remember at one point, somewhere in Singapore in the early 19th century, they built a sea wall, which they basically sold out to the lowest bidder. That company or whoever it was basically made the sea wall in porous materials, so it crumbled. Which just seems like, okay, that seems like the most basic thing. Even I wouldn't have gotten that wrong if I was asked to build it. And so there were a lot of kind of like really big mistakes like that. But I think simply that colonialism can be blamed, but kind of inadvertently, because the fact that the British built up these kind of urban areas here, and you attract suddenly like huge population rises, people are coming in very, very quickly, and that puts pressure on the infrastructure that exists. And the town infrastructure never seemed to keep up with population rise. So there was always a lag of like building infrastructures to deal with the population, to provide enough water, for example, or to have proper drainage systems. So there was a lack of preparedness, but also at the same time, it was simply the population was expanding so fast that there wasn't so much they could do with it. It's not like planning a city, planning a new city where you build it from scratch and then people come in. It was like the other way around. The people came in and they had to build around them. So, I mean, is that the fault of colonialism, or is that just kind of an inadvertent byproduct? You know, having these urban towns which are growing, and there's opportunities here. People were coming in through from across Asia to move here, seeking those opportunities. But one of the things I would say is that the difference from kind of the before and the after is urbanization itself causes problems. Before you have this kind of massive urbanization, a lot of the indigenous housing, for example, was very much built around the weather and the environment. There's lots of communities that lived on or near the water where houses were built on stilts. So it didn't matter if the tide comes in or if there's a flood, because they were designed to allow the water to move and to run off. But as soon as you get kind of slum housing or houses built around the water, then that doesn't happen anymore. So you get this kind of big change from these kind of areas which are built kind of very organically and designed around the weather, to this area which is very rapidly urbanized, where you've got housing that simply wasn't built for managing the extremes of the weather. And that is, as you rightly note, increases levels of social vulnerability to extremes, and particularly for the poor, who tend to build their houses around the riverine areas or the coastal areas because it's cheaper land. So, I mean, are these patterns still in place today? I would say there's a huge difference between Singapore and Malaysia. Singapore has rapidly developed since the 1960s. Since they became independent from the British government, the Singaporean government have invested a lot into urban infrastructure, and flood management. And this is one of the things that I always try when I'm talking to my students about, like, flooding in Singapore, and they don't really get it because they've never experienced a flood in Singapore. You only have to go back to, say, the 1970s, and you would get huge floods and huge droughts in Singapore, which would affect tens of thousands of people. But since the 80s and the 90s, which is, when my students grew up, actually even the 2000s these days, they've just not experienced it. A flood for them is like a slight inconvenience where, maybe their trainers got wet and the bus got delayed on their way to school. And that's literally it, because the Singapore has really, really managed the environment. If you've ever been to Singapore, it's very urbanized, very high tech, very modern. A lot of that at the expense of the green environment, but it's a very livable city. Malaysia, on the other hand, is a completely different kettle of fish, and you will find that the areas that traditionally flooded under the British colonial regime are still the same areas that flood today. They tend to be the areas that get the worst of the monsoon, but they're also the areas that are the most rural and the most underdeveloped. And they still are. And every single year where you get the monsoon flooding, it's the same areas year after year after year that are still hit. And in the urban areas as well, again, a lot of those same patterns still persist. So, there's a huge kind of story there of like development and developing, in terms of the trajectories of both countries.
Thanks for that. That's really interesting. I'm going to ask one final question about imperial weather now, and I probably should have asked this one before I asked the previous question, because it kind of links to the present again. And of course, kind of the thing that kind of overhangs this, and I think kind of underpins a lot of historians' interest in, certainly my interest, and I don't want to speak for you here, but a lot of our interest in kind of past weather and how knowledge about weather is created, is related to present day concerns about global warming.
Yeah.
And I wondered, how did like present day concerns about global warming in Singapore and Peninsula Malaysia figure into your thinking? And one of the things I thought was so interesting about your book was your discussion about urban heat islands urban flooding, insufficient water supplies, which are all very current day concerns, but which you trace back some very long, particularly for people who normally study global warming and kind of the STEM subjects, much longer time series or a lot longer historical antecedents into those themes. I suppose kind of the big question here then is how does a discussion of past conditions and developments help us to understand the present being global warming and kind of these past to present patterns
Yeah.
going on there?
Well, I think maybe there's two sides to that. I mean, I kind of got into the history of the weather and history of meteorology because of scientific projects. So I suppose, I started off by thinking very much about modern day science and trying to help to build data sets that go over the long term to really understand climate change. And I really see that there's a place for historians in this dialogue about understanding how the weather has changed. And I think that's really important. Reclaiming data from the past, which will help us to construct those models, to help us think about exactly how fast things are changing and to what extent things are changing. And I think that's also really important in terms of understanding extremes and to what extent extreme weather is becoming more frequent or more severe. So I think that that part of the history is really, really important. And because of that, I hang out with a lot of scientists, and a lot of my colleagues are doing work on things like urban heat. And living in a city like Singapore, I can't get away from that discussion because every day we're surrounded by urban heat. And I mean, even I've been out here for about 15 years, and I can tell the difference just in that short period of time. And, it really is getting hotter and hotter, especially the last few years. And people are really starting to get to that kind of cusp of how are we actually going to manage this. So it's a dialogue that's around me all of the time. So I can't switch that dialogue off. But to the extent to which history can help us manage or create solutions, I don't know. It's wonderful for helping with the reconstructions, but to what extent can we learn? I haven't yet come across any kind of historical way of managing heat, for example, that would be useful for the modern day because our circumstances are so much different. In the past, if it was a heat wave, you could go to the coast for the day or you know, run a cold bath or, something like that. But these days, the temperature has risen so much that those things are simply not as applicable anymore. And we haven't had to manage the extremes of weather that we're now having to deal with. So, whilst I don't want to write myself out of a job in the future as a historian, and I want to say that, my role is very relevant. I think my role seems to have been more in kind of informing people that we've had to manage climate change and, we will continue to be able to manage climate change because as humanity, we will adapt. Whether we can come up as historians with any incredible solutions, I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I think we have a role certainly to tell people how it has been, how we've managed, how we've adapted. And maybe that's a positive message. I don't know.
Well, I think Imperial Weather does a wonderful job of showing just how that's the case. It's a wonderful book. Congratulations
Thank
on its publication. I really enjoyed reading it. Before I let you go, though, and it's a horrible question to ask, considering that Imperial Weather was only just published.
you.
What are you working on now? What's next?
Ah, well, actually, when you publish something, there's obviously a very long period between actually completing the original manuscript and actually coming out in print. So initially, when I first finished the manuscript, I was a bit like, I don't know where I'm going. I feel like my brain is empty, my body is hollow, and there's nothing left, and I have no idea what to do next.
Yeah,
But it's been a couple of years now, probably since I submitted that manuscript, and I actually started working on a new book this year, and I'm on chapter 3 at the moment. So, but
amazing.
yeah, well, I don't know. I read it, looking back at it, I'm like, I'm probably going to have to rewrite all those chapters already. But it's about the rubber industry in Colonial Malaya. And it seems a bit of an extreme from the weather, but I suppose it was some of the weather records because I was looking at agricultural records that started making me look at some of the rubber records. And I got really interested in this kind of interconnected global history of Malaya as the rubber industry. There's a kind of massive interest from the US, obviously from the UK, connections with Indonesia, which was the other massive rubber producing country at the time. And so I've kind of got very excited, but everything's about rubber at the moment.
This is
But
wonderful.
I'm a rubber bore.
No, 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 I'm not gonna no, no, not, definitely not a bore. That sounds well needed, very interesting. I look forward to seeing and hearing more about it. It's more
Yeah, and
environment.
I've been doing it for
It's more
3 years.
environmental history as well, eh?
It is more environmental history, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for sharing that with us and for discussing Imperial Weather with us. It's a wonderful book, as I said. I want to also thank the listener, you listener, for streaming or downloading. Yeah, my name is Philip Gooding, and you've been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
We would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The Indian Ocean World podcast is produced under the SSHRC-funded Partnership Appraising Risk, past and present. The podcast runs in conjunction with the annual speaker series at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University, Montreal.